Good evening or afternoon for those joining us from the West Coast. You are tuning wherever you might be tuning in from, and welcome to Cooking the Archive Community Recipe Books in Los Angeles. My name is Samantha Rowe, and I am a volunteer for the Programming Committee of the Archivist Roundtable of Metropolitan New York, and the organizer and moderator of this evening's event. I'm particularly excited to introduce tonight's webinar as it marks the next iteration of ART's thematic conversation about archives and food, which began in winter 2022 with a site visit at Bonnie Slotnick Cookbooks, followed by a curated historical pizza walking tour with Scott Wiener in the spring. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Suzanne Joskow, who is joining us from Los Angeles, California. In this virtual presentation, Suzanne will discuss her ongoing project, the Community Cookbook Archive, consisting of over 400 Los Angeles-based community cookbooks that span 3 centuries. Suzanne Joskow has a BA in American Studies from Yale University and an MFA from Otis College of Art and Design. In her artwork and curatorial practice, Joskow focuses on the connection between physical material and social history, often in the form of maps or archives. Most recently, she is immersed in Los Angeles food history, exploring the ways Angelenos, particularly women, cooked at home. Joskow's work has appeared in galleries, community spaces, institutions, and publications throughout the United States. She works and lives in Los Angeles with her husband and daughter. And before we begin, I have just some general housekeeping items. For the duration of this presentation, we just ask you that you kindly silence your microphones and put any questions that you have in the chat box. We will have time later to answer them in the Q&A portion of the event. This event is being recorded, so if you would like to turn off your camera, please do so now. And if you haven't already, please register for our upcoming in-person event, Letterpress Workshop, 500 Years of Printing in 1 Hour at the South Street Seaport Museum on Saturday, March 11th at 1:30 p.m. This is limited to 20 members, so be sure to RSVP. I will include links to Suzanne's website and, of course, our upcoming events in the chat box for reference. And without further ado, I welcome Suzanne to begin her presentation.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today, and particular thank you to Samantha for inviting me to speak, and to Bill for helping set up the Zoom. It's very exciting to be part of your ongoing exploration of food-related documents. I'm going to give an overview of my project, the Community Cookbook Archive, Los Angeles, and then look forward to opening things up to a conversation with all of you. So if there's any recipes or books, things that come up in the presentation and you feel I've moved off of the slide too quickly, don't worry, we can easily return to those at the end. I like to start with this excerpt from the Introduction to Tasty Delights and Remedies, which is the Community Cookbook in the Archive from the First United Methodist Church in Compton. Whenever and wherever people gather, food is usually one of the primary reasons or focus of the gathering. Food provides nourishment for our bodies, but when we gather around food, it also becomes a subject of conversation. Food is nourishment and food is subject. This quotation feels particularly resonant today as you are a group who really understands the fascination with ephemera and the rituals of our daily lives. At its core, the Community Cookbook Archive is a record of Los Angeles stories through food. When I speak about this project, it is often with an audience who is either focused on an interest in LA history or in culinary traditions. So I must say it's really like a special pleasure for me to be talking with you today with a group who is centered around questions of archiving. Before I dive into talking about community cookbooks specifically, I felt I'd be remiss not to quickly give some context for my own archival practice as an artist. The term an archival impulse comes from the art critic Hal Foster, who in an essay of the same title that he wrote in 2004, and you may be familiar with this, Foster writes in that essay, archival artists seek to make historical information often lost or displaced, physically present. To this end, they elaborate on found image, object, and text. Artists do inventory, sample, and share as ways of working. So with this idea of layering in mind, my own work with the archives began as actually an interest in map making. In graduate school, I found myself doing site-specific work related to Los Angeles's physical history. I sometimes refer to my work as vertical mapping. While a traditional map depicts a landscape at one point in time, I will pick a single site and map it visually over time, somewhat like the rings of a tree. Here's a documentation photo from a series of window displays I was invited to do at Circus of Books, which is a gay pornography bookstore in West Hollywood, or it was, it doesn't exist in this form anymore. But the store's windows were always covered. And so for this project, I filled them with layers and layers of curtains that were printed with historic images and text related to the site, which had once been an avant-garde performance space. I also love to cook, and during the same time, I began collecting community cookbooks that I found at the bottom of boxes and thrift stores and at estate sales. And it took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that this compendium of cookbooks I was collecting was itself a sort of mapping of Los Angeles. Pictured here is an LA community cookbook from the 1950s, which quite literally opens with a map of the neighborhood, which is one of the many ways which community cookbooks document place. I'll elaborate on that shortly. But having an archival art practice also takes me into spaces that are not white-walled galleries and into institutions that are not exclusively centered around art making. Last year, I had the honor of putting 99 books from the Community Cookbook Archive on display for 6 months at Los Angeles Central Library. Many of the books in my collection are not preserved in institutional settings, so it was a pleasure to work with the library to share the books in this way. So food as nourishment and food as subject. Will Rogers wrote in the 1929 Beverly Hills Women's Club cookbook, pictured here, eating is the biggest thing we have. It's eating that keeps us here. As the Community Cookbook Archive project has grown, I've learned that each cookbook offers not only recipes to eat, but a point of view on food's role in our lives and in our creation of memory. So with that context in mind, let's jump into the archive itself. I want to begin by presenting a loose definition of what makes a community cookbook, or at least share how I've chosen to define them. So what is a community cookbook? It's a recipe from a collective group or organization rather than an individual author. It usually features home cooks, not professional chefs. It's often self-published. It's frequently a fundraising tool, and it's connected to place. For this project, LA County. So those are some very literal parameters of what makes a community cookbook. But as I began building this collection, which really first started, as I said, as a personal passion, I fell in love with the books and my understanding of them deepened. So I think we need to expand on this definition a bit further. To begin with, community cookbooks are aesthetic objects. Many feature intricate hand-drawn covers and artwork throughout their pages. Everything from their bindings to their era-specific color schemes adds to their visual impact. Here we're looking at hand-drawn illustrations in a 1972 cookbook from the Wilshire Employees Recreation Club. I bet you could have guessed the decade. This is a 1950s cookbook from All People's Christian Church, Los Angeles, which has a terrific cover drawing depicting the church's original building in South Los Angeles. a book of favorite recipes from La Crescenta Women's Club, 1950. This book features one of my favorite design elements where they've reprinted individually handwritten recipes rather than typeset ones. These two mid-century cookbooks from secretaries' organizations are another favorite. They're designed to mimic steno pads. And here is a booklet of prize-winning recipes submitted by Angelinos to their local ice delivery company. It's an incredibly delicate creation. This is a 1965 cookbook from the Church of Latter-day Saints Brentwood Ward. It has a hand-painted wood cover and woven binding, and it really is a one-of-a-kind art piece. One aesthetic that many of these books share is a scrapbook quality. Here we have the women of the Los Angeles Bridge Unit in Inglewood, 1986, photographed as you might find in a yearbook. And then 60 years earlier, we have another group photo. This one is from the Three Links cookbook, the Daughters of Rebecca, a women's auxiliary to the Oddfellows, and it was printed in 1925 in West Los Angeles. From the late 1970s through the 1990s, the LA County Fair produced yearly cookbooks, which were filled with prize-winning recipes. Each year, the fair had a theme, which was also reflected in the cookbook's cover art. And of course, even the World Championship Lakers published their own cookbooks in 1985 and in 2001, filled with funny headshots, recipes from players and staff, and even Magic Johnson's mom. In addition to being aesthetic objects, community cookbooks also serve as primary source documents. These books are unusual in that they actually invite you to add to them. Many include blank pages specifically for this purpose. It's also common to find personal inscriptions inside the books, along with preserved recipe clippings, and this marginalia can give them an almost diary-like quality. Community cookbooks can also be subversive narratives. Okay, so this is a big one. Because most community cookbooks are self-published, they often give voice to those whose stories don't appear in traditional publications. Historically, this was particularly true of women. Many of the recipes in the archive were compiled by women-led organizations, such as church auxiliaries, college sororities, and support groups for working mothers. On the left is a poem that appears in the opening of an Azusa cookbook that I believe was printed in the 1930s, although it is undated. I'll just read the first paragraph. She rises up at break of day, and through her tasks she races. She cooks the meals as best she may and scrubs the children's faces. With school books, lunches, ribbons too, all need consideration. And yet the census man insists she has no occupation. So it's a poem about the unpaid labor of domestic work at that time. A lot can get smuggled in under the guise of a recipe book. Pictured here is the oldest book in the archive, How We Cook in Los Angeles. It was published by the Ladies' Social Circle of the Simpson Methodist Episcopal Church in 1894. The book contains not only recipes, but numerous essays on food and community contributed by local women. In the essay on the left, LA suffragist and abolitionist Caroline Severance recounts a memory of eating at Louisa May Alcott's with Louisa May Alcott's family. This is just another example of how, under the banner of a quote, woman's cookbook, contributors were able to document deeply personal histories. I'll come back to Caroline Severance as she's connected to many books in the archive. Another important example of subverting mainstream narratives is the Federation Cookbook. This cookbook, originally printed in 1911, was compiled and published by Bertha L. Turner, a well-known Pasadena caterer who also served as state superintendent of domestic science. She's pictured here on the right. This book is filled with recipes contributed by, and importantly for, Black women from throughout California. In her seminal book, The Jemima Code, journalist Toni Tipton Martin writes about the Federation Cookbook. She says, quote, "This recipe collection signals a shift from one intended to educate white housewives to to one that preserved the culinary values inherited and practiced by the Black middle class. Again, this was published in 1911 in Pasadena, really putting Los Angeles at the forefront of this sort of printed culinary self-documentation. Okay, and then here we have The Gay of Cooking, published in 1983. While the previous cookbook was significant for printing the names of its Black contributors whose work in the kitchen was often uncredited, here we have an example of anonymous contributors, likely for safety reasons, including the compiler who simply goes by the Kitchen Fairy. At the time of this book's publication in the early 1980s, the mere visibility of gay culture, acknowledged in this book through food and body humor, was revolutionary in print. So cookbooks as aesthetic objects, as primary source documents, and as subversive narratives. Community cookbooks can also be translations between cultures, pictured as East-West flavors compiled by the West Los Angeles Japanese American Citizens League in 1966. The title, East-West, really says it all. Many Los Angeles community cookbooks serve as a bridge between cultures through food. I'm a firm believer that you can travel through space and time just by taking a bite. Here's the 1976 Estonian cookbook from the LA Estonian Women's Club. This cookbook, like many of the bilingual ones in the archive, clearly states a goal of passing traditions between generations. This 1968 cookbook from the Daughters of Vartan, Los Angeles, an Armenian women's organization, includes a glossary of food and cooking terms, which is another sort of translation. And in Cooking the Sephardic Way, compiled by Temple Tiferet Israel, Los Angeles in 1971, essays about Sephardic Jewish tradition accompany the recipes. In juxtaposition to immigrant food stories, the Tongva or Kiz people have been cooking and eating on the land that is now called LA for thousands of years. Their food history in Southern California is many-fold longer than that of any other cuisine. Early written records of Southern California native foods were mostly transcribed by outsiders. In contrast, these community cookbooks contain recipes directly from tribe members. As much as community cookbooks have helped Angelenos stay connected to faraway homes or past generations, they have also served to document the growth of Los Angeles itself. Community cookbooks are undoubtedly a record of place. This is a cookbook in English and Spanish published by the Adams Normandy Neighborhood Association, covering 5 city blocks in the area of West Adams. And here's a cookbook from the Philanthropy and Civics Club. Like many books in the archive, it features a photo of the group's clubhouse. The building on South Wilton Place has now been demolished, but it is remembered here. And it's not just photographs, and the books also have visual renderings as well. This is a 1953 cookbook from the Women's Ebel Club, and it opens with a hand-drawn sketch of the club's courtyard. When possible, I've taken the cookbooks and recipes back to their connected sites. That interest in mapping again, as I did here with a picnic at the Hollywood Bowl, which has several cookbooks associated with it. And these are 2 cookbooks compiled by docents at the Gamble House, the famous American craftsman home in Pasadena. Indeed, nearly every major site in Los Angeles has a cookbook associated with it, from the Natural History Museum to the radiology department at the Antelope Valley Hospital Medical Center. That one is called Rad Recipes. And last but not least, community cookbooks are instruction manuals meant to be used. This is one of the realities that led me to start digitizing these books and to create the Community Cookbook Archive online. This idea is at the center of my work as an archival artist, that there are many multi-sensory ways to interact with these cookbooks. At their core, these books were designed to come alive in the kitchen. They aren't just intended to be read, but also to be tasted. I began cooking from them myself, but I wanted to make a place online where others could begin to access them and contribute their perspectives and stories as well. It's really something that I am still building. This is just a glimpse of the browse feature on the website. You can browse by title and also by decade, and soon you will be able to browse by map location as well. So I'm going to click into the entry for the Friday Morning Club cookbook, just to give a snapshot. The Friday Morning Club was founded in 1891 by Caroline Severance. Remember her from the Alcott's Table recipe essay. Sometimes called the mother of clubs, Severance played an important role as a women's organizer in Los Angeles. She was an outspoken abolitionist and suffragist, and the Friday Morning Club, while a social club for middle and upper class women, had a distinctly political bent. Severance invited educator and activist Booker T. Washington to speak at the club and later hosted his wife Margaret for a 3-week visit. Here is Severance pictured with Susan B. Anthony and activist Rebecca Spring. The Friday Morning Club's first official building was designed by Arthur Bennett Benton and built in 1900, pictured here. The club incorporated and issued stock, becoming one of, if not the first women's clubs to finance its own building. As the Friday Morning Club grew, they sold this first Mission Revival style clubhouse and all of its furnishings to the Catholic Women's Club, who dismantled the building and moved it to a new location in Los Angeles, where a version of the building still stands today. The year before the Friday Morning Club cookbook was published, the group built a new Renaissance style revival clubhouse designed by the firm Allison and Allison. The cookbook celebrates that new building, pictured here in the book's opening pages. If I've cooked from a book in the archive, I try to include these details in the entry as well. With this cookbook, I made author and Friday Morning Club member Olive Percival's rose conserve. It's no surprise that Percival submitted a recipe featuring roses to this cookbook, as she was a serious gardener at her home in the Arroyo Seco area of LA. The Huntington Library even posthumously published her children's guide to gardening. One of the things that excites me most about the Community Cookbook Archive is what happens when you start looking at the LA Community Cookbooks as a collective. They begin to talk to one another, challenge each other, and weave a tapestry of Los Angeles over time. Harkens back to that idea of rings of a tree. Here are 3 books in the Community Cookbook Archive that connect back to the Friday Morning Club cookbook we just examined. On the left is a 1963 cookbook produced by the Friday Morning Club Juniors, the young women's group of the same organization. Published 40 years after the club's first cookbook, it gives a glimpse into the club's progression over time. In the middle, we have a 1925 cookbook from the Los Angeles Catholic Women's Club. You'll remember the Catholic Women's Club purchased and moved the entire original Friday Morning Club building to their own site. It's an unusual kind of shared physical history that's echoed in these 2 cookbooks published just a year apart. And on the right is a cookbook for the Long Beach League of the John Tracy Clinic, a nonprofit educational center for young children with hearing loss, founded by Louise Tracy, the wife of actor Spencer Tracy. The clinic is named after their son. For many years, the clinic occupied 806 West Adams Boulevard, which had previously been the longtime address of Caroline Severance, founder of the Friday Morning Club. People often speak about Los Angeles sprawl and a perception that the city stretches outwards, forgetting its history. But to me, these cookbooks tell a very different and layered story about LA's interconnected topography. Another example of this phenomenon connects back to Bertha Turner. I'm by no means the first person to draw attention to the significance of the Federation Cookbook discussed earlier. But as I leafed through other cookbooks in the archive, I was intrigued to find Miss Turner's name in 2 additional cookbooks as well. One is in an advertisement for Turner's catering business in the Superior Cookbook, 1927, put out by the Lamanda Park Women's Club. And the other is a recipe she contributed to the 1935 Pasadena Shakespeare Club's cookbook, where Turner was a caterer. Here's a look inside the Federation Cookbook, where Black women shared recipes they cooked at home. And here's an advertisement for her catering services. Seeing Turner's name also appear in these other professional and primarily white contexts adds additional insight into the food world she moved between. As an aside, I have made Turner's recipe for deviled egg, tomato, and crab canapé. I am not usually in the business of critiquing the recipes in this book, but it is worth a mention that this recipe is particularly delicious and I highly recommend it. Um, for this project, I've chosen to focus on Los Angeles because that's where I live and work. These are some of the LA County communities that have produced cookbooks currently in the archive. I think one could probably do a collection of community cookbooks focused on any region, but it would result in an entirely different set of stories. For one thing, Los Angeles's growth as a city was bound to its complex food history. Long before ranches and citrus orchards dotted the San Gabriel Valley, the area was home to indigenous oak trees. For millennia, these valley oaks offered not just wood material, but also nutrient-rich acorns, a dietary staple of the Tongva or Kiz people who lived there. By the late 1700s, however, Spanish missionaries took the land and began clearing and cultivating it for agriculture. The practice continued after California's statehood, with settlers arriving by wagon. In the early 20th century, a major way that Los Angeles told the story of itself to the rest of the country was through the image of bountiful produce. Even today, California agriculture produces more than half of the US grown fruits, nuts, and vegetables. These locally grown ingredients are prominent throughout the recipes in these books, particularly citrus, walnuts, almonds, and dates. Another aspect that's specific to LA is the city's identity as a destination for people coming from somewhere else. Take this quotation from the introduction to the Landmarks Club cookbook from 1903. Californians come from everywhere. Every state, nearly every county in the Union is represented here. While a few other cities are as cosmopolitan as Los Angeles, no other city in the world is made up of so many intelligent and well-to-do people so far away from their old homes and from homes so widely scattered. Perhaps in proportion to the population, there is no other city in whose households are in vogue so many varieties of cookeries from so many lands and localities. Of course, being a city of many cultures has not come without conflict, appropriation, and erasure. Those tensions can spill over to the food and language in these cookbooks. Here we have again the 1894 How We Cook in Los Angeles. The title presents its contents as an introduction to specifically Los Angeles cuisine. In particular, the quote Spanish department section sets up a way of organizing recipes that appears in many subsequent Los Angeles community cookbooks. Beyond simply a reference to Spanish-speaking nations, the term Spanish was often used to whitewash or Europeanize food that in fact had longstanding roots in the Americas. While this may have been done as a marketing technique to make white settlers feel moving west more open to new dishes, it was also a tactic for those who had lived in and owned land in Los Angeles in the decades before statehood, when the area was still under Mexican rule. Those Californianos often took great pains to distinguish themselves from newly arrived Mexican immigrants by emphasizing and sometimes fully inventing direct links back to colonizers from Spain. Many scholars have written deeply about this topic, and I encourage you to check out the further reading section of the archive's website for links to more on it. Here's a book on the other end of the spectrum. It's highlighting food from newly arrived Mexican immigrants. Comidas Mexicanas, published in 1936, features recipes from the Pasadena Settlement House. The book includes recipes in Spanish and English on facing pages. The Pasadena Settlement House was one of many similar charity-run houses throughout the Los Angeles area. While some believe these homes functioned as mechanisms for segregation and at times targeted Americanization, they also provided necessary social services for immigrants, particularly women and children. It was primarily those newly arrived women who produced this cookbook. As this is LA, the imagery of Hollywood as a place both real and imagined also runs through these cookbooks. One could give a whole talk just on this topic, but just for the sake of time, I pulled a few examples. In addition, it's hard to celebrate Los Angeles kitchens without also acknowledging the county's ongoing crisis with homelessness and food scarcity. While this project is one of visibility, it also has palpable absences. The root of most cookbooks in this collection is a desire to share food. So here are 3 LA organizations that are doing important work to combat food inequality in LA County. When I talk about this project, I like to shout them out. I also invite others. I know this is a mostly New York audience, but if anyone out wants to share other organizations in the chat, that is always welcome. And as mentioned, the archive has a further reading section with writing on food, Los Angeles, and archiving. Here are a few of the books that are on there. And again, I'm always looking to add to the list and welcome suggestions. As I began cooking from these books, I realized that in many ways, the community cookbook has moved online, in particular through the shared recipes and photos on Instagram. The archive has its own Instagram where I share photos and writing about individual books. I also hope as others cook from community cookbooks, you will use this platform to connect with and add to the archive. And finally, I love to share recipes that highlight how the way we cook at home can be so different from what is made in professional kitchens. My daughter I made this a couple weeks ago, and my daughter just went crazy for this recipe. So I wanted to include that one. I am often asked what are the most unusual recipes I have come across in these books, and that's a question I'm happy to expand upon more in the Q&A. There are some really good ones. You can't get better than the title Pleasure Dome. I think that's the best recipe title ever. But I always try to couch my answer in the fact that I am not in the business of judging these recipes when I cook them. It's fun to see how tastes change, and more so, it's amazing to time travel through food. For me, each recipe is an invitation to sit down to a meal with its contributor, to span decades, sometimes centuries, while living in the same city. I think it's an incredible honor. So on that note, let's talk.
Wow, that was fantastic, especially a tomato soup cake.
Yeah, very good, very moist, and did not. I really enjoyed it. It's a spice cake.
Ooh, interesting. I wonder if like you bring that to like a house party, it's like a conversation starter,
Absolutely. I mean, and you don't know, you can reveal the secret ingredient subsequently, so people don't prejudge it.
I know. Don't judge a book by its cover. So yeah, I welcome anyone of our audience if they want to write some questions in the chat box. This is our time to ask Suzanne anything that might be you might be curious about, if you want to learn more about, if you have questions about her practice, if you have advice. Okay, I see one question from the chat. Let me just pull it up. We have a question from Getty Judy. That was fantastic. Do you have any thoughts about how you might expand to include the treasures that exist in recipe boxes?
That's such a great question, particularly because, as I started sharing this project, I hear from all sorts of people. I hear from scholars who are doing kinds of research, but I hear from a lot of people who have either community cookbooks that they want to donate, which is amazing and always accepted, but also just an expansion of that, large cookbook collections, and of course, these beloved recipe boxes from mothers and grandmothers often. And I know I have encountered there are a lot of people out there there isn't really a place for these things to go, and maybe people don't cook from them anymore, or they're just a list of recipes, as happens a list of ingredients, as happens in the community cookbooks too. Sometimes they are not full recipes, so they are kind of hard. You have to do a lot of guesswork with them. It's a great question. I think it is. I am still very focused on Los Angeles, but I am interested in kind of expanding what one might count as a community cookbook. So I think there could be a place for those kinds of recipe documentations, particularly if they were tied to LA. But it's a great question because those are and in fact, I've thought about making my grandmother's own. I have her boxes and making them into a cookbook. Because again, they had they're handwritten on note cards. They can really be really beautiful. So Yes, that's something that has been broached because it's a objects that a lot of people are looking for a home for, to have them memorialized. It's not something I'm doing yet, but it's something I'm thinking about. It's really good inquiry.
Actually, just for my own personal
Yeah.
interest, like I think to piggyback on that kind of question about documentation, I'm assuming a lot of these community cookbooks, they might have like drafts or like, works in progress or like some written types of manuscripts. Like, would you, as like a compendium, like to the finished product, would you also collect those as well and like sort of like have them together or?
Absolutely. And I think I mentioned to you just before we started the Zoom, when organizations still exist that have cookbooks in the archives, I love to connect with them. And sometimes they
Yeah.
have tons of history to share. And sometimes they are surprised to even find out that their organization produced this document, that more often than not, there's not a ton of institutional memory and through line on those things. Um, but would love to fill out the archive with more personal stories connected to the cookbooks when we can find them. Whenever I cook a recipe, I Google the contributor if their name is included, and sometimes it's impossible to really understand or know who they are. And sometimes you can really find the person because they're, for whatever reason. I've found a few obituaries from recipe contributors, because the cookbooks are quite old, they're no longer alive, but their obituaries mention the organizations that they were part of. So I can become quite confident, oh, this is the person who contributed this recipe because it says she was a member of, this Long Beach club during this time. And so it's fun to just find out a little bit more about the people behind the recipes as well, particularly when I myself am eating them, because you're kind of sharing a meal together.
Yeah. And I think that's just the beauty of, I mean, I'm biased because as an archivist, but like when you spend so much time with someone or institutions, papers, like you get to know them in a very intimate way that not others do. And with especially like with these like primary sources, like you are going back in history and you are experiencing what they were experiencing and you're trying to understand like what was happening during this time, like the use of ingredients. And there's just like such a historical value to that as well, to really gain insight of like why maybe they selected this type of ingredient compared to this one. Oh, maybe it has to do with the time that they were living. So that's fascinating. I
Absolutely.
love that.
Yeah, no,
Let's
I'm
see
glad
if
you
there's
brought
some
that
other.
up too, because, oh, good. Well, I'll just say there could be a whole talk just about technological innovations and how they show up in these
Oh
cookbooks,
yeah.
from the blender in the 1930s and earlier, the invention of baking powder and all of that. You really, the
The
microwave,
microwave.
certainly, yeah. So that stuff is all really evident in these books in a fun way.
Oh, that's such an interesting outlet too. Cause like, I mean, just the potential of like the research value with these as well as like you were saying is like these were like very like DIY like
Mhm.
approaches,
Yeah.
and who knows in terms of like the types of resources that were available to them at the time. So like pinpointing like certain eras like of certain kitchen equipment and like what was available to those a blender these days. I have a blender, we just assume that everyone, but in terms of like
Yeah,
various like innovations of like what was used, a hand mixer, or are you going to do it by hand, so that's really interesting
absolutely.
too. Let me see. I'm sorry, I'm hogging all the questions. We have a question from Jolie, who also is someone who collects community cookbooks, which is
Hmm.
great. And she just wants to know like where you acquire or where you look for yours.
Sure. I mean, I certainly started out primarily at, you know, yard sales, swap meets, estate sales, that sort of thing, because I found that there was not a ton of interest in these books. A few, sometimes in Los Angeles, you will get ones that have celebrity contributions and connect back to some other arena where there might be collector interest. But unless there's overlap there, for a long time, there just was not a ton of interest in these books, and they were pretty easy to come by. Certainly with the pandemic, I started looking online more. That is also just an amazing resource. And I will say, I have noticed a shift since I started collecting to now. I think there is more institutional interest in these books than I saw even certainly 5 years ago, maybe. Just more, this audience probably knows better than I do. Archives, libraries are saying what voices are not in our collection that should be, and institutions are looking to these books. And so I'm finding that's creating more interest in them, which is wonderful. But for the most part, like I said, I hear from a lot of people who are looking to donate them because they're emotional. People have a connection to these books, but they don't necessarily cook from them anymore, but they don't want them to just disappear. And so I'm very lucky, as this project has gone public, that I'm also it's hearing from people about the books that they have, and I really welcome that.
That's great. So a bunch of kudos coming from the chat, but another question I have from Cheryl: how many of the cookbooks have like ephemera or handwritten notes or additional recipes that are sort of tucked in?
That is another great question. I don't know the number, but a lot. Particularly, these are also often were given as gifts, so it's very, very common to find inscriptions in them, which is fun and also honestly kind of helpful because uh, you would be surprised the number of times that the books are not dated. And so I'm often but they're not dated, but they'll have First Lady's recipe in them or something. And so there's clues to help date them, but oftentimes too, inscriptions really help me zone in on when they were from as well, because often those will be dated, the notes will be dated. And so, yeah, that helps me with sleuthing around what the books are for. But yeah, very common gift inscriptions, other recipes stuffed in them. That's, yeah, very frequent.
Yeah, that's just my day-to-day is being like
Yes,
part-time detective.
exactly. I know.
Putting clues
You guys
together,
know.
filling in the blanks, yes, and trying to understand, especially with those like, when things are primarily undated, because when you want to just have the month and the day, because people know what the year is, at the time, but later on, yeah. So using those types of like external documents are really useful because you can sort of pinpoint like at least an approximation of when it could be. So that's great. Yeah. And actually, just to tag on, do you have like a favorite piece of ephemera that you found in one of your books? I'm sure you find some really quirky stuff.
Gosh, yeah, a favorite. I don't know. I did find like a program for like a performance that was put on by the group, and
Oh, nice.
probably the cookbook was sold at that performance, as part of the bake sale or something. But that was a pretty fun one to find. But I'll have to think about that.
I know. I'm sure you find some really interesting stuff. I remember when we were at Bonnie Slotnick's cookbook store, there were a bunch of like examples of things that she had shared with the group, and just the vast time periods of where they were coming from. Some from like the 1800s that someone had like collected a letter and it was like tucked in as a bookmark. It's really lovely. Yeah. I
Well,
have a
you just
question.
remind you. Oh, before you say,
Yeah. No,
you
go ahead.
reminded me of something I think is worth saying to a New York audience, which is just a reminder, I will say, is Los Angeles is so young comparatively as a city, and particularly as a publishing city. I think the first hardcover book was published in LA in like 1850 or 1851. So just to give some context for that too, of like that same year, a community cookbook was published in LA. Like these books by an East Coast standard may not seem as old, but they do date back to early publishing history here. So I feel like that's an important reference point too.
That is duly noted. Okay, I'm sorry to cut you. So I have actually a different type of question from Kimberly, more of like logistical of like how you're developing your website. She wants to know, did you design the site yourself and you maintain it yourself? How long did it take you to reach a point where you felt the site's organization really worked for you? And she said it's really engrossing.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for the question. Yes, this is all right now a one woman passion project. So it is Wix site that I sort of tricked into working like a site with entries. It's technically the template for it is if you were selling something, but I'm not selling anything, but that's how you can click on something and get an entry for it with information. The site is not by any means complete. I reached a point where I was like, I think there's enough here that it is I can be made public. It is not so something that there are now over 400 cookbooks in the archive. I am not able to host them all online, although they are digitized. And so a big way the site functions is just I hear particularly from scholars who are looking to do certain kinds of research, and I can then share with them digitizations that are relevant to the type of thing they're researching. So it's really right now kind of just an entry point into the archive more than something that exists in and of itself. Um, I am behind in uploading all of the books and their covers and all of that. So it's really a lot about it is a work in progress, is something I eventually hope to also connect and make searchable in other ways outside of itself, so that if you looked up in other archives, you might come upon these cookbooks. Those are all long-term goals, but I think I again, like sort of tried to give some context of what is it to be an archiving artist, and that can mean so many things. The definition of that, even for me, keeps changing. But I will say, I wanted the site to feel very inviting, and I wanted it to include at least the covers of the cookbooks, because to me that it was just an opportunity to kind of honor what these cookbooks are and how they have been designed and what precious objects they are to the people who made them, to give that, to kind of carry that through. And so that makes elements of the archive not look like a traditional archive and maybe not follow kind of the most familiar or best practice ways of archiving. And that was something I felt I could do because I'm also doing this as part of an art practice. And so I have heard from people that they find the searching by being able to see the covers really accessible in a way that for some people just seeing lists of text is not. And so that's exciting to me and something I hope to expand on.
That's a great answer. Actually, I wanted to touch on your artistic practice because, as us being archivists, it's really interesting to see this connection between what we see as an archival document, but what you're seeing as artistic practice, and like this union between the two. And I know that mapping is like part of your practice. And I remember it in the beginning, you mentioned that one of the future, I think, changes for your website would to include like some type of mapping component. And I would love to learn more about what you mean by that, because I think geomapping is like, especially with like digital humanities, such a innovative tool, and it really is a great visual too. And so I'm just curious to hear from your perspective of like how you envision that and where you see it go.
Yeah, and I think actually you had in one of our previous conversations mentioned too that geotagging is really happening on like the back end of a lot of archiving, which I think is amazing. I had honestly, what I am working on, and again, like I am somewhat limited by my own technical skills and ability to Google how to do things, but basically almost like a Google map, like a Google map, where you can look at a map of Los Angeles and see on it all of the dots representing the books and zoom in on a neighborhood. And all of them are, almost all of them are connected to a very specific address, because these organizations, almost all of them had a physical place that people met. If they're not the ones that are neighborhood groups, things like that, like, they would appear in the map, related to that somewhat specific location, although they may not have an exact address associated with them. But I am really interested in, again, like a researcher's ability to say, I want to look at what's going on in historic Filipino town, what cookbooks were produced here. And also, the demographics of LA neighborhoods change dramatically over time. And so really fun to see, oh, this cookbook was produced here. And then 50 years later, this cookbook was produced here and people were eating in totally different ways, 2 blocks from each other. And just visualize that in a mapping way, and also search through that piece of your brain, it is very exciting to me. And I know I can do it, but like I said, it's a lot of books. So I'm just figuring out how to best host that on the site, but it's coming.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And I mean, just like the mapping component too, like even to take it like a step further, which I'm sure you've considered, but like yes, like the place of where it was published or it originated, but if it's a type of cuisine and they're like
Yep.
like touching on where their origins are from, so even that like relationship between where it was produced, but also like type of cuisine and what it's trying to mimic, or like from the origins of this person's home, like, you know, I think there's just so much potential.
Oh, well,
Oh,
thank you.
we have some feedback for you. There,
Oh,
someone recommended
yeah.
History Pin. Apparently, it is a
Yeah.
website for user-generated archive of historical photos, and I think it might have some type of mapping component. And someone also recommended if you want to migrate your site to WordPress, apparently there's a geomapping function on that as well. I can send this to you in an email later.
Yeah, well, I'm
Thank you,
I'm taking
everyone.
notes. Thank you.
We're
That's
very
very, no, like I said,
resourceful.
I was really excited about this audience because this is wonderful. This is really fruitful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, no, we're very resourceful bunch. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, we have about like, I don't know, 8 minutes left. If anyone wants to put any other questions in the chat, if not, I have a whole list. Also, if you have questions for us, Suzanne, please, this is your time. We're happy to answer as best as we can. Yeah.
No, I mean,
Um,
this is, well, I guess, can I ask one question? I do, in terms of care for the books, I keep them in, to the best of my knowledge, archival best practices. When they've traveled to things like the library, they're wrapped and preserved and all of those things. I do have them, as you saw in the photographs, around food. And I'm curious, to me, that's important. I don't have them touching the food. I'm very careful with them. But to me, it's important that they be physically in the kitchen while I'm cooking from them, that they be, I guess I'm curious, how much of an eek factor is that for the professional archivists on here to see that? Because I know that that is obviously, not, that would be a big no in a lot of traditional archiving, to have food anywhere in the vicinity.
I mean, we're not in a traditional repository, and we're, yes, you want to maintain them for future generations, for your own personal preservation of them. But, I know for me, like the archivist in me says, oh my God, no. The other, because then, it can introduce pests and there's just a lot of things, but this is a living archive. You're using this, you're cooking from them. This is something that is meaningful to you. And this is something that has value to you. If this was in a library setting or like in a more traditional setting, I would say maybe stay away from the liquids and the jams and stuff, or anything that's sticky and permanent. But since it's something that you're actively using and you're cooking from, it's still a cookbook,
Yeah.
It's just, I think and please, I have people like chiming in our chat too. But I think it's really your perspective and your attitude towards them of how you want to regard them, because they're still meaningful and they're still collectible items. I'm sure there were stains in them prior to your to you
Many, and in
accessing
fact,
them.
speaking of ephemera, I mean, that's the best tell in a cookbook, is the super stained page, because that's the recipe that was cooked over and over and over again, so that I don't add to that, but I do love
Yeah.
actually to find that in the cookbooks because it's very telling.
Yes, for sure. I have two interesting questions that I'm going to put them kind of tied together because there's some overlaps, but one from Jeffrey, another one, a follow-up from Getty Judy. One is about collecting like modern and contemporary community cookbooks. And the other side is, do you actually collect, I don't know how you would do this on your own terms, but like maybe you would crawl a website that has like a online version, or like a born digital version of a community cookbook online.
Mm. Well, in terms of contemporary ones, I do come up to the present day. I'm a little, in fact, a few recent ones have come in that are not. There's quite a few that are not up on the site yet. And yeah, I am continuing to collect up to the present day, because actually, again, speaking about, when I look up these books in World Catalog or something, it is often the more recent ones that appear nowhere. And by more recent, I mean sort of like 60s onward. There are a few very, very old ones that appear nowhere, but certainly as you get more recent, they are not in other collections, and I still think they have incredible value. So yes, there are not as many of those. up on the site right now, but I have been sent quite a few recently. And so I will be uploading those as well. And I do some of like Happy Trust and stuff. There are digitizations of cookbooks online. I have I have done a couple reprints of books through the archive where I felt like they are like I did a reprint of the Comidas Mexicanas book because it's not easily accessible, but there's a digitization online, and I felt like people might want to have a physical copy of it in their home. And so there are a few where I have taken where they're really scarce or hard to access, but there's a good digitization, or I've done a digitization of them, and made a hard copy, because I think, again, there is, again, hopefully I'm sort of preaching to the choir that, the art world you talk about of like that aura of the object. I think cookbooks can have that, and people want to write in them and add to them. So a few times I have done that, and that's something I'm open to doing more of.
And in terms of like, I guess that a lot of them are definitely out of print, I'm assuming, but like in terms of like editions, like would they have like notations about that? Like this is 1 of 100 and you have the 5th one, or yeah, is that captured anywhere
Once
from your
in a
experiences?
while, and I will also say some of them, like that Beverly Hills cookbook that that had the ham recipe from Will Rogers that I posted, that they published that 1929, 1930, 1931 with slight, and then again in 1963 with tremendous changes, but with slight changes between each year, but mostly the same. So there are also additions in that sense. But a few of the cookbooks do look at themselves more like art objects. So there's a cookbook put out by the Friends of the UCLA Library in the 1970s that is quite about this big, and it's actually a portfolio where they went into the UCLA library and pulled community cookbook recipes from their other books and paired them where artists did like an illustration that's then paired with the recipe and annotated with the book. And so they released this as a fundraising thing in the 70s, and it's like a portfolio of artworks connected to recipes, but it is itself a cookbook in that sense. And that as an example is something that was produced as editions, and it kind of is putting itself much more knowingly in a visual art space. But for the most part, no, because these books saw themselves, like more like yearbooks or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I think we have one more question. So let's see. This is kind of fun. So Julie has another question saying, I'd also love to hear you talk about what dishes you decide to make and any challenges with cooking historic recipes. That's a great question.
And yeah, these have all been amazing questions. Thank you.
Yeah, it's fun.
No, that's a great one. I mean, there are all sorts of challenges come with particularly older recipes, because you start to get into less uniformity in the kitchen. So you will get things like cook in a slow oven, and sort of everyone was meant to know what temperature that meant in their oven. And to me, that's maybe cooking at 300 degrees, but you have to do interpretation there. Sometimes it doesn't handhold in the way that contemporary recipes often do, and there's an understanding that you would know how long a pie takes to bake, or at what temperature to bake a pie in your own kitchen. So that is a challenge. I do sometimes run into funny things. I mentioned about the invention of baking powder. Sometimes, although all of these cookbooks come after, for example, the public availability of baking powder, you will get in them recipes that themselves are 100 years old, or a grandmother or great grandmother's recipe. So some of the recipes can be much older than the cookbooks themselves. And so I have they made cookies with baker's ammonia, which is a little disconcerting to have an ammonia smell in the kitchen. How that works is the ammonia bakes off and it creates a rise in a cookie. And nobody got sick from them. It was fine. It worked out. And the recipe says to get the baker's ammonia at your local druggist. I got it on Amazon. I don't think CVS is selling that anymore. But in terms of picking the recipes, I just try to pick a huge range. If they, again, I try, if I am drawn to something, if it's unusual or specific to Los Angeles, a lot of these recipes, something is titled, Van Nuys salad or something, I might be more drawn to it because it kind of, again, connects itself so specifically back to place. But no, I mean, I like, it's kind of an addiction. I could keep I plan to cook from all of the books, but I just would keep going. It's just a very fun thing to do.
That's wonderful. I'm
I
going to
hope
make
that
sure I
answers the question.
capture, yeah, I'm going to capture some other points because I want to make sure that I send these to you, but I can follow up the emails. Some people have some interesting like recommendations and
I
stuff.
see, yeah, the Autry, that is in fact how I did the reprint of the Comidas Mexicanas, is from the Autry's from their
Wonderful.
scan. That version, there's another version of that book, but they are, I think, the only ones who have that book in their archive. So yeah,
Oh,
thank you for
wow.
someone for posting that. And I think I linked to it on the site as well. But if I don't, that's great.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, this has been such a wonderful webinar. And thank you all for joining us during your dinner time. And thank you for your support. And of course, a very special thank you to you, Suzanne, for taking time to speak with us about your fascinating project. And I hope we can see where your project takes off. And if we can be of use to you, please stay in touch. Yeah, this concludes our evening. Thank you all for joining.
Thank
And
you so
hopefully we'll
much.
see you, some of you in 2 weeks at the next art event. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.